Have you ever been motivated by want? If you're human, then you probably have. When you're hungry, you want to eat. When you scrape your knee, you want a band-aid. When you're tired, you want to sleep. Those things are necessary defense mechanisms to be alive. Of course, want is tied to more nebulous, less important things too. For example, I really want to buy a custom Eustace Winter doll really badly, but I probably don't need him to be alive. Not like those other things I listed at the very least. But what about those in-between things? Things like, I want to be liked. Do you need to be liked to live? To be alive? In the literal sense, no. So, let me rephrase the question. Do you need to be liked to deserve to be alive? Let's put a pin in that for now. Hello, if you're new here, I'm Mocha. I'm a game developer who won't shut up about things I like and I make video games. This past June, I participated in the 2026 run of the Battle Action Fantasy Jam, a game jam where you, quote, make a visual novel that feels straight out of Shonen Jump. This was a month-long game jam that I participated in with my good friends Minnie and Ven, two people who should be familiar to anyone who has watched stuff on this channel before. Over the course of this particular game jam, we worked together to make the game Today I'll Be the Hero. This is a game where, well, you're the hero. With your merry little band of friends, you're going to save the princess, because that's what heroes do. And that's all I can say on the premise without spoilers. I'll say spoilers for later in the video, and I will give a warning for when that happens, and maybe I'll even put the timestamp up here. For this game, Ven was in charge of the game's BGM and sound effects. Minnie worked on art, I worked on programming, and then both Minnie and I handled parts of the writing together. The game itself plays by switching between an overworld map, which you will navigate by progressing through nodes. Each node represents a snippet of your adventures with your companions where you will make choices, or perhaps simply witness the consequences of your past actions. It's simple on the surface, but has a lot of little narrative design tricks beneath, which killed me a little. Out of all the game jams I've done within the past year, this is the game whose scope and vision has differed the most from the initial vision by far. While naturally, basically all games have a change in their development just due to the difference between one's brain and their actual output ability, the original idea was, well, let me back up a little bit. As mentioned before, this was a month-long game jam. Every single other game jam I had partaken in with Minnie and Ven was only about 2 weeks long, or at the very least we started it late and only used 2 weeks. So a whole month? Sure, we knew we wouldn't be able to sustain the pace that we can for 2 weeks over the course of a whole month, but we still allowed ourselves more scope. Our initial pitch was we were going for a Disco Elysium / Citizen Sleeper style narrative roguelike. A lot of buzzwords there. There were lots of little choices, there were branching nodes, and companions could die based on decisions you make. The main point of our initial pitch was that there was a lot of cascading choices and narrative design. Compared to what the game ended up being, the feeling of the game was intended to feel less like a storybook and more like a simulation. But yeah, that's not what the game ended up being. The game now has no branching nodes, companions die only in extremely relevant plot events, and there is much more limited narrative design. But still a lot, just not stupidly ambitious narrative design. A lot of the core ideas were kept the same. It does have the hallmarks of Disco Elysium / Citizen Sleeper style CRPG narrative gameplay. There are many choices that will change the outcome of the narrative, and there is an overworld node system. However, the choices have much less impact on the overall outcome. Many of them are choices that have impact solely in a single node, or the only impact is flavor text. A big thing I wanted with all of the choices that a player would encounter is that I didn't want any single choice to feel too obvious in what it actually did. With the exception of maybe the first 3 choices in the game, which are pretty obvious in how they set you on your initial route, but past that, there's no more handholding. The idea was to make it feel less like one specific choice sealed your fate, and more like this is just the result of how you've been living. Sure, that vagueness probably makes certain endings harder to find on purpose, but I think it gives the game a more realistic feeling, you know? Real life doesn't really work like a single or even a handful of dialogue options either. This is also why I ended up building in quite a few invisible variables to the game that the player never quite gets to see. This isn't just limited to the usual expected invisible variables that you might see in a Telltale game like how much do people trust you, but I have this affect more concrete variables as well, like how much money you've got left or how many resources you can actually spare. So instead of staring at a number going down, players just feel it. Like, okay, I've clearly blown through my budget this run, so of course the only option I have at the shopkeeper is to leave. Regarding the game's visual style, early on, we knew we wanted something that felt like Disco Elysium or Citizen Sleeper, with a fun, long-scrolling text box on the side. A lot of other things did change though. Initially, we were going to have a scrolling background that characters existed in, with full character sprites walking through it. There would also be a separate map overlay that would pop up after every node rather than the persistent overworld you see now. For the actual core look of the game, we came up with the idea of having a gradient map over the art to make it instantly obvious when players would change routes. Every asset is drawn in blacks, whites, and grays, and then given color via a gradient map. It was vaguely inspired by World of Horror since I've been playing that a lot recently, but overall I believe there are 6 different gradient maps that the player will encounter in-game. Yay! In addition to providing clear visual feedback to the player, different colors also helped set the mood of a route. There are many scenes within the game that are the same or nearly the same in one route versus another route. Yet, just by being overlaid with a different gradient map, the feeling of the scene is totally different. I like that a lot. When playing around with gradient mapping shaders, I discovered this PS1 style shader by Grau. Rather than a smooth gradient, it maps everything to a fixed set of colors, and where that gets really interesting is with transparency. Rather than a smooth transition, it would create a very cool blended color look that reminded me a lot of old school games that didn't actually have transparency and would need to use workarounds. The downside to the shader is that for more subtle color shifts, particularly in the darker end of the spectrum, colors would collapse into a single hue. I tried to adjust the shader code to fix this, but I couldn't, so I hope you like how it looks. One more huge time saver was the fact that each character only had a singular speaking sprite head rather than dozens of different expressions. Right at the start of the jam, I set it up so that the head pops in automatically based on who's talking, and that alone saved me so much time. For the last game jam I did, I literally spent hours setting up JSON files with every single expression. And speaking of time sinks, yeah, dude, the biggest one was definitely all the little CGs I made Minnie draw. She drew over 100. And also if you didn't even make it into the game. Aren't I a terrible producer? Pause. Let's examine that terrible producer title, shall we? I want to talk about the Jester's Theater. This is my little darling that had to die. I copingly believed in it up until like the next to last day, which is way further than I should have believed in it. The Jester's Theater was inspired by the Tiger Dojo from Fate Stay Night. The idea was that rather than giving a guide to players, it could help lead them in the correct direction by informing them what exactly their decisions did. Even though we probably could have added it in a post-jam update, I think I am content that it wasn't added. While I love meta elements in games, I feel like adding the specific kind of meta of a Jester's Theater might have been a touch too different from the rest of the game. If I added it, I was afraid that the game might feel as though it was a puzzle to be solved rather than a set of experiences that shape you. Regarding the game's narrative, do you remember that initial very different pitch for the game structure? The game's vision changed to be more linear, yes, but a lot of that didn't happen until the very last minute. The idea of designing nodes to be in a certain order, changing depending on what choices you had made beforehand, having all of those cascading decisions affect each other, that was really stressful to plan out. I made a list of variables and I was trying to connect them and figure out what variables would be relevant in what nodes and how early they should be relevant and so thereon and thereof, and what was fair. It's hard. Game design's hard. Did you know that? Especially since it had been a while since I had written something for a branching narrative, suddenly playing on hard mode with needing to account for all of these different options was scary. What was in scope? What would I be able to handle? What would actually accomplish the narrative feel that I wanted in the game? This was all very overwhelming to me, so I procrastinated by working on other parts of the game. I made the game's dialogue system, I got the node system working, I figured out how to have branching choices, I created a system that would reflect who was talking, I made an audio manager, etc. And honestly, procrastinating saved me for a lot later in the jam. If I hadn't set up a very solid and flexible base to account for the writing and all of the variability in it before I had written it, I would have definitely been completely screwed in the last few days. In terms of scheduling, full transparency, June was a very busy month for me. At the start of the month, I had a lot of big work deadlines that kept me occupied. Then I went to Narrascope, a narrative game convention. It was a fun time going. I had a really nice and chill time, took a lot of notes, learned a lot, and I got to meet a lot of developers in person for the very first time. And thank you to everyone at the dinner who let me talk about Eustace Winter for many hours. Having a month-long jam meant that I kept on saying things like, oh, we got plenty of time, and the time pressure that I usually felt during a 2-week jam was just not hitting. So yeah, a lot was left until the last 2 weeks. Uh-oh, who would have thought the month-long jam? It actually was a 2-week long jam, effectively. And even then, probably a good 70% of the game's writing was done in the final week, with a good 50% being done in the last 4 days. For context, the deadline of the jam was June 30th, which was a Tuesday work night. By the preceding Friday night, a lot of the work still wasn't done. But not to worry, for someone like me, extreme pressure is when I really come out and shine. With this sort of situation, I can totally just lock in and be fine. Oops, idiot. The family emergency, uh-oh. Without getting too much into it, a family member had a medical emergency, and I suddenly was extremely distracted. It was the sort of thing that was really serious, but once resolved was completely fine, but like, how was I supposed to work under those circumstances? So Saturday and most of Sunday was a complete wash as a result, leaving me with 48 beautiful hours to pull this all together. Those last 48 hours were really brutal. In retrospect, I have no idea how I managed to pull it off, especially when I had my job, but hey, never doubt someone who's stupid. This was a big jump from all my other recent jams where I reached the deadline at a leisurely pace. Instead, I was working up until the last minute. Of course, a huge shout out to Minnie and Ven for their amazing work. You've been listening to a lot of Ven's OST up until this point, so you can tell how amazing it is. I gave them a very rough and deliriously made wish list for an OST, and they delivered. And poor Minnie, who had to look at all my stupid little requests. Of course, Minnie wrote a ton for the game as well. Particularly on the endings, she helped hit a lot of big emotional beats. Beep beep, I'm going to talk about the game's narrative now. This will contain spoilers for the game, so if you care about that, you can play the game. It's only about an hour-ish long, especially if you use a guide, so you can just like watch it real fast and then return. Or if you don't care or have already played, then continue watching on, my friend. Alright, is everyone gone who wants to be gone? In that case, I'm going to talk about the main appeal of the game to me, which is self-cessed, aka the act of loving yourself. This, secretly, is what Today I'll Be the Hero is about. Every single character with a speaking portrait in the game is the hero, or at least some version of themselves. How did all the party members end up this way? Well, I'll leave you to play the game to find out. I really enjoy stories about clones, doppelgangers, other versions of yourself, and generally just witnessing yourself in a physical other form. There is something about being confronted with your own self as another person that changes the dynamic. There are tons of different ways that this can be realized. Would you feel pity toward your other self? Frustration, loathing, jealousy? Would you want that other self to exist, or would you rather kill it? In this game, we wanted to represent many different versions of how the story of meeting yourself could go. Whether you are proud of the person you have become or ashamed of them, they're still you. This is a story about your party members looking at the hero as much as it is about the hero looking at these party members. The warrior supports the hero so much that it becomes both of their downfalls. The mage misses their friends while loathing themselves so much that it becomes their downfall. The jester wants to be loved so much that it... Wait, a lot of this is about orchestrating your own downfall, huh? Isn't this kind of depressing for a story that's supposed to be about loving yourself? Anyway, here's a little relationship chart I made trying to keep track of different dynamics. Since the relationship to the hero changes the most between routes, and I was running out of space, I didn't include that here. In terms of minutia, my secret favorite character was the rogue. I wonder how obvious it is to tell that from the writing. The rogue is a version of the hero who, via the plot, becomes the princess, and then escapes the tower. Hating their fate so much, they resolve to kill the hero rather than risk this fate coming to pass once more. But this wasn't initially their intended plot, actually. the core of their concept remained the same. They were going to be a version of the hero who wanted to kill the current hero. But it was only after I tried to figure out how they fit in with the rest of the story, combined with figuring out what happens to the princess if you save her in an ending that isn't the true end, that things just came together so naturally that it feels obvious in retrospect. I'm actually quite pleased with the rogue's writing. Depending on how you play, you end up seeing the end of their arc before you see the start of it. Their actions and its supposed resolution may seem confusing without the context of who they were before. This sort of reverse solving is something that I really enjoyed to see, so it was fun to indulge in. Also, side note, by complete coincidence, in the last few days before the end of the jam, Gigi Murin and Flavor Foley released a song all about self-cest. And boy, if I wasn't playing that on loop during the last few hours of development. But while Today I'll Be the Hero is about self-cest, it is perhaps even more importantly about dreams. Or maybe that's the same thing? The antagonist of the game is the dream, a creature that will enable the wants and desires of a particularly deluded individual to a fantastical extent. For the average person, this doesn't actually change much. Either they have dreams that they'd like to happen but don't truly believe in, or they're an exceptional person who has already accomplished those dreams. But for those ordinary people who have desires that destroy them to not have accomplished, but yet can't quite achieve their dreams no matter how they try, that's where the dream thrives. I've been thinking a lot about my dreams lately, what it is I want to accomplish in life with my games and my art, and just as like a person who exists in this world. As a purely realistic self-evaluation, I find myself a pretty unremarkable person. I have worked hard to achieve the things I have, but in terms of having an exceptional skill or talent that makes me stand out amongst my peers, I don't really have one. And for a long while, this bothered me. For a long while, I felt as if in order for my art to be worthy of existing, I needed it to be extraordinary and impactful. Maybe it did not necessarily need to be popular, but it needed to be looked upon by others as something good, as something that people would walk away from and think, wow, how sincere and awesome. I don't really like to explain the intent behind my games, but I will do so a little here, if only because I am embarrassingly frightened of how people might misinterpret it, which is probably just a sign of me being a bad writer, I know, but indulge with me here. At the end of the game, the protagonist no longer pursues their dream of being a hero with the fervor they had throughout the rest of the game. This is not a result of them giving up on their dream per se. In fact, whether or not they will repeat the actions that got them into this mess is left a little bit ambiguous. But rather, it is an acknowledgement that they are not defined by their dream. They do not need to be consumed by their dream in order to be content, happy, or to deserve to exist. The whole world praises those people who can live life as extraordinary people. This is just how society functions. Oftentimes, this gets translated internally into the pressure of, you cannot live life if you are not an extraordinary person. I want this game to say, actually, living life as an ordinary person is nothing to fear. You can still deserve to feel the sun on your face. Thank you for watching this devlog and for 12k plus subs. Yay, and that's all folks. If you're new here, consider subscribing, watching some of my other videos, etc. I've got quite a few videos on backlog that I've neglected over the past several months for some reason, so I'll be banging those out soon. Thank you to everyone for your incredible support recently. In between my last upload and this one, my channel grew quite a bit despite the fact that I was a terrible person and hadn't uploaded in a while. I'm excited to share more of what I've been doing with you all, and take care, and have a wonderful day. Bye bye!